Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our Risk Assessing Your Credit Union's Vendors webinar. My name is Abby Clark, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're not familiar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right-hand corner of that widget. If you experience any issues and have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed as well in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Hillary Dewhurst, VenMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She will discuss inherent and residual risks, what your credit union needs to be collecting on your vendors to manage risks, and the who, what, why, when, and how of vendor risk assessments. You'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our How to Do a Vendor Risk Assessment infographic, Types of Third-Party Vendor Risk ebook, and Inherent Vendor Risk sample questions and next steps ebook, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the Related Content widget. So with that being said, I would like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Hi there, welcome everyone. Today we are tackling the basics of vendor risk assessments for your credit union. And to start, we're going to review the who, what, when, and why of vendor risk assessments. And then we're going to talk about the roles and responsibilities of the stakeholders that support them. From there, we're going to discuss what goes into vendor risk assessments, including the questionnaires, which then brings us to collecting our due diligence documentation. And then we'll wrap up with best practices. So let's jump in by talking about vendor risk assessments and the basics of vendor risk management. It's a really good time to let everyone on the call know that this function, different names depending on the organization. It might be vendor risk management, it might be vendor management, it might be third-party risk management. But essentially the function should serve the same purpose. So who's involved in vendor risk management? Well, that's the business owners. That's risk managers, the third-party risk management team or the vendor risk management team, executive leadership, and stakeholders across the organization. What is it? Well, it's the process of identifying and measuring both the types and amounts of risk that are present with any product or service, and therefore the vendor relationship. So when do we do these risk assessments? Well, we always do them prior to initiating a new product or service, and then we do them periodically throughout the engagement or if there's any material changes at the vendor. Finally, why do we do them? Well, first of all, it's a sound business practice. It makes sense, and it adds strategic value, right? We want to make sure that we're getting what we're supposed to get out of that relationship. But finally, it's a regulatory requirement for credit unions. So let's talk about the vendor risk management team, or in some organizations that may be just a single individual, but they're responsible for that whole third-party risk management framework. That means they own all the rules, the tools, and the processes that make third-party risk management possible at your credit union. They own the policy, they own the systems, the workflows, and they establish the requirements for the due diligence documents, for example, for vendor inventory. They determine the methodology for risk rating, and they oversee and direct all those activities as they're necessary to identify, assess, and manage vendor risk. And that means that their job is to hold everyone accountable and keep them on track. So to break those responsibilities down a little bit more, it basically means that they are going to be responsible for some very key aspects of that program. One is to determine the criteria for critical. They're also going to identify what the methodology is and the mechanism for identifying and rating both your inherent risk and your residual risk. They need to make sure that all the processes are followed and executed in the right order. And they establish all the standards for due diligence, including those vendor questionnaires, any documentation, and how much subject matter expert review we need. They should be coordinating with that SME and the vendor owner to make sure that any issues that come up during due diligence are mitigated appropriately. And then they set the schedule for periodic risk reviews, due diligence, risk and performance, etc. They should be tracking and monitoring all open vendor risk issues. They should be providing stakeholder reporting. And if there's an audit or exam, they should be prepared to participate in that and gather all the requested documents. Now let's talk about vendor owners. So these are the folks in the line of business that own that vendor relationship. And so they own all the risk associated with it too. So essentially, they're responsible for identifying, assessing, and managing that vendor risk throughout the life cycle, and they're responsible for all required risk and performance monitoring and following those tasks as vendor risk management has established. They need to also make sure that their vendors are following those processes as well. So what do those vendor owner responsibilities look like in practice? Well, let's walk through a few of them. First of all, once they identify a potential vendor, they should get busy on researching that vendor's background, qualifications, and reputation. And the vendor owner is the one responsible for filling out that initial inherent risk assessment. Once that risk rating is established and due diligence is appropriate, then they need to prepare their vendor to go through the due diligence process. That means helping them understand the expectations, the timelines, and making sure they're getting in everything on time. If they're not, they need to go back and engage that vendor and make it happen. They should be reviewing any SME reports that talk about the sufficiency of their vendor's controls and issues or any other concerns. And if there are issues, they need to work with the SME and the third-party risk management team to identify appropriate mitigations and get that all tracked as an open issue. If there's issues that are appropriate for post-contract, meaning they're not a big deal breaker, but something we still want the vendor to address, then they should make sure they get written into the contract. And throughout the entire process, they need to hold vendors accountable for issue remediation. They also need to practice ongoing risk monitoring and periodic risk reviews and gathering that due diligence once a year, but they also need to be doing performance management. So let's talk about subject matter experts who also play a very big part in the risk assessment process. So subject matter experts, they can be internal or they can be external, but these are the individuals that we've identified as having the necessary depth of expertise and understanding for their specific risk domain. And because they have this credentialed and professionally certified expertise, they are qualified to give us an opinion on the sufficiency of the controls. They're also responsible for making sure that if there are any issues regarding the vendor's controls, that they're written up and documented in an SME risk review report. So remember, SMEs are folks that have professional certifications or credentials in their specific risk domain. Now, to dive into SME roles just a bit more, one of the other things that SMEs do is they should be working with your vendor risk management team or your third-party risk management team to establish what that vendor risk questionnaire looks like. So what questions do we need to ask on that questionnaire, and what kind of documentation do they need to see in order to verify controls? They do perform a technical assessment of those controls, and they determine if they're sufficient. They also should be writing that report, as I mentioned before, and if there are any issues, they should be providing as much detail as they can around potential mitigation steps and working with that vendor owner to review the evidence of mitigation once it's been accomplished and to say, yes, we agree, the issue's been mitigated. And then finally, with all of the vendors, their main job is to say, yes, we think that this vendor is good to move forward with or not good to move forward with. Now, I wanted to share the third-party risk management lifecycle just so everyone can see that within the 3 stages, we are doing some sort of risk assessment throughout the whole lifecycle. So obviously, in onboarding, we're doing that inherent risk assessment, that initial risk assessment. We're determining what due diligence is necessary, and we're reviewing the controls. After we review the controls, we can look at residual risk, but we'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation. Once that vendor is onboarded and they're business as usual, then they go into the ongoing stage of the life cycle, which means that periodically we reassess the risk, we update and refresh due diligence, we monitor that risk and performance, and if things are appropriate, then we do any contract renewals. But if they're not appropriate and the vendor's no longer working for us, then we go to offboarding. And during the offboarding stage, there is some risk assessment around the termination and the exit plan execution. So we always want to make sure that we understand the risks existing in that relationship throughout the life cycle. Now, during that initial risk assessment stage, we're really seeking to accomplish 2 things. One is we need to determine the types and amounts of risk that are present in that relationship, and we need to determine if that product or service is going to be critical to our organization. Now, when it comes to defining criticality, we have 3 questions that work really well in most instances. The first one would be, would a sudden loss of this vendor cause significant disruption to your credit union? And would that disruption impact your members? And if it took more than 24 hours to get that vendor back online, would there be a really negative impact on your credit union? If you answer yes to any of those, then you should consider it a critical vendor. But there are a few more nuanced things to consider as you're determining criticality. One would be is if there are significant financial investments, resources, and time required to implement that third-party relationship and manage the risk. Another would be, would there be a material impact to your operations or resources if you had to engage an alternate third party or if you have to bring that activity in-house? We also want to consider if that third party fails, are we going to have a lot of regulatory scrutiny, or could it result in enforcement actions or fines, etc.? And then finally, the last thing to consider is what is the vendor's capacity to really negatively impact your reputation. And so, of course, when we're defining risk, we have to think about risk in 2 tranches. One is inherent risk, right? That is the most possible risk that that vendor could expose you to based on the product or service. And at this point, when we're thinking about inherent risk, we're not thinking about the controls that can help mitigate the risk at this point. And we usually rate the risk on a tiered system, usually with a low, moderate, and high risk. Now, just a reminder, critical is not a risk rating. Critical is a label we use to identify those vendors who pose the most risk to our operations or our customers should they fail. Now, we also have residual risk, which is the risk that remains after we consider those controls, after they've been implemented. So, can we reduce the likelihood, the occurrence, the severity, or the impact of that risk by applying controls? Now, just to recap, every vendor needs to be labeled either as critical or non-critical, because critical is not a risk rating. It is the label that identifies those vendors that will most materially impact your organization or its customers should they fail. And then they need a risk rating, so low, moderate, or high. Now, keep in mind that you are doing this right at the beginning, but if something should happen with one of your vendors, maybe there's a really negative news event or a merger or acquisition, you do want to go back and do that risk rating again, and you want to reevaluate if they are critical to your organization. Now, when we're thinking about the types of risk that credit unions specifically have to address, these are the types of risks that we should be looking for in those risk assessments. So credit risk, compliance risk, cyber or that infosecurity risk, financial risk, and that can be not only the risk that your organization will suffer financially if the vendor goes down, but also if that vendor is financially healthy enough to sustain their business throughout the lifetime of your contract. Interest rate, liquidity, operations, reputation, strategic, and transaction risk should all be considered when entering a relationship with a vendor per the NC.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. And this poll question is, does your vendor risk management framework clearly define the roles and responsibilities of the stakeholder? Yes, we have detailed roles and responsibilities for each stakeholder. Partially, we have some roles and responsibilities defined. No, but we are in the process of defining them. Not at all, or you don't know. And Hillary, it looks like right now we have some time to answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience.
Great,
and let's do it. Awesome, and that question is, we have a really small credit union. Some of our vendor owners are also risk experts. Is it okay if they are completing the inherent risk assessment, or should someone else do it?
This is tricky because when we get into very small organizations, it's likely that folks are going to wear more than one hat. The issue of a vendor owner also being a risk expert is not really that extreme. However, I would suggest that if the vendor owner, for example, is also your risk expert for cybersecurity, and there's a lot of cybersecurity risk in the engagement, that at a minimum someone else reviews the information that the risk expert has provided. Ultimately, it would be best to have someone else perform that particular risk assessment, but if it can't be done, at least have somebody else double check the information. You may not be able to have true separation of duties, but you should at least have a secondary review. I hope that helps.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll. Here are those results. And by the way, you may have noticed reactions, such as a thumbs up or heart, coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. And before we move on, as a reminder, in the Related Content widget, you'll find our How to Do a Vendor Risk Assessment infographic available for download. As we just discussed the basics of a risk assessment, this infographic will be a valuable resource to reference. Hillary, let's continue with the presentation.
So in this slide, as we come back to our risk discussion, we're just providing a few examples of questions you might see on an inherent risk assessment to help you determine both the types of risk and amounts of risk that are present in that relationship. So just to pick a few here on reputation risk, we want to focus our focus should be rather that when a vendor has direct interaction with our members or they're providing products or service to them, there is probably a high reputational risk. We also want to look at transactional risk if that vendor is processing any financial transactions on our behalf. Compliance risk. Are we relying on this product or service to help us maintain compliance with any regulatory guidance? Or is this a significantly regulated product or service? Business continuity. Would that disruption in service cause a material impact to our credit union or that of our clients and members? And then cybersecurity. Is this a technology-related service that would in any way require interaction with our network? Or does the vendor have access to our network? So those are just a few examples of questions you might use on it. So once you've completed that inherent risk assessment, or your vendor owner has completed it rather, you'll have two really important pieces of information. The first one is that risk rating or level of your vendor, and the second is whether or not your vendor is going to be critical to your organization or your customers. Now, these two pieces of information are really important because they inform us on not only what due diligence to collect, but how to treat and manage that vendor throughout its lifetime. So when we get to due diligence, the first thing to remember is that there's certain information we have to collect on every vendor, regardless of their risk rating or their criticality. So the first couple things we want to think about are just the basic information. Who are they? What's the address? What's the ownership structure? Are they a DBA or a PKA? Do they have any foreign entities? Where are the physical locations where they will be performing work for your organization? We also want to know a little bit about the company in general and who the leadership team is. We also want to make sure that we have their articles of incorporation or business license and their tax ID because that helps us validate that they're a legitimate business. We want to double check that they have basic liability insurance, and we want to see a certificate for that. And in some cases, if necessary, we want to look at their references. Now, it seems that this slide should have preceded our last one, but that's okay. Just a reminder, what are we doing in due diligence? Well, first of all, we're validating the legitimacy and the good standing of the vendor. So we can look at things about their basic information, like we talked about before, but we can also look at reports from Better Business Bureau, Dun & Bradstreet, or any other credit agencies. We want to go through and do an OFAC or a PEP check, and we want to just basically check out their reputation through doing a news search or looking at customer complaints. Now, once we have that basic information, we'll go in and we'll start determining whether or not we need additional information to really look at specific controls based on the product type. Now, we'll get into residual risk in just a bit, but let's jump to, all right, so as we take a look at the different types of risks we might be trying to mitigate, we'll go through a few of the control areas and some of the due diligence items. So the first one up is for those vendors that access, transfer, process, or store sensitive information. The control areas here are information security, their human resources, privacy, compliance, vendor risk management, and financial health. So for this type of vendor, we would want to collect any certifications that they have, any proof of regulatory compliance. We want to look at all their policies and procedures. We want to look at their SOC 2 Type 2 report. And we're going to look at those very specific information security controls, including vulnerability and penetration testing. We would need a list of any critical vendors for our vendor, especially those that may also access data. And when we talk about how our vendors manage their vendors, we really need to be holding them to a high standard. So we want to make sure that they have a third-party risk management policy, that they have processes, that they can prove that they do risk assessments and ongoing monitoring. We want to look at the privacy policy and, of course, all the financials. Now, when it comes to vendors that have access to our system to sensitive data, so we're not pushing data back and forth to them, they can only get it through our system, we have a lot of the same mitigating control areas, but as you'll notice, some of them are grayed out because they're not as big a risk in this type of engagement. So again, we have information security controls. We really want to know a lot about their human resource controls. So are these folks being background checked? Are they trained properly? Is their performance monitored? Of course, we want to look at privacy compliance and vendor risk management as well. So the due diligence items we might get for this type of vendor would be, again, those certifications and proof of regulatory compliance, all the policies and procedures, SOC 2 Type 2 report. But you'll notice that we don't need that vulnerability and penetration testing because they're only accessing data through our system. We want to make sure that we get their list of critical vendors and their privacy policy. Now, the reason I contrast these two is to help you understand that not all vendor access to sensitive data has the same risk. And as part of scoping your due diligence to the risk, it's important to understand how that vendor is getting the data. So in this instance, we might be looking at a vendor who directly interacts with our customers or clients, but in this case, our members. And that could be everything from a call center to somebody else that's, interacting with them in any way. It's really important that we look at these control areas. So reputation is a huge one. We don't want to do anything that will damage our reputation, so we need a vendor with a good reputation. We are really interested in how they're managing their human resources, how they background check them, how they train them, and the performance monitoring. Of course, privacy and compliance are also extremely important as they might be accessing sensitive data because they're directly interacting with our members. And we also want to make sure that those interactions are compliant with all regulations. We also, again, want to know about their vendor risk management processes. So for the due diligence items we look for, again, those certifications and regulatory compliance, make sure that all licenses are current. We want to look at all the policies and procedures, but especially the privacy policy. Now we come to a vendor that has a high business impact risk or a critical vendor. So again, the areas that we want to look at would be communications, making sure that we have the right service level agreements in the contract and active monitoring. We're really interested in business continuity and disaster recovery. Again, their employees, their compliance, and their vendor risk management. So in this case, due diligence items would include those business continuity plans and tests. Very important. We want to make sure that these plans are tested. Disaster recovery planning and testing. Certifications, proof of regulatory compliance, all policies and procedures, SOC 2 Type 2, their list of critical vendors, very important, especially if those vendors are critical for our vendor to provide services to us. We want to make sure that they are doing those vendor risk assessments and that they have proof of monitoring. All right, what about due diligence for vendors that have a high cost associated with them? That could be either implementation costs or costs to manage them or costs to replace them. So we definitely want to look at their financial health and their business continuity and disaster recovery. But we always want to make sure that we have the right SLAs in place in the contract. So for due diligence items, again, certifications and proof of regulatory compliance, all associated policies and procedures, SOC 2 Type 2 reports, and financials. Our last example deals with those vendors that have unescorted physical access to your facility. So we're trying to control that we have good access management, that we understand who is coming onto our premises, that they have a background check, that they've been trained, and that they're monitored. Privacy and compliance are also huge areas of control. So we want that list of all the employees who will be actually granted access, and we want evidence of their background check. We also want evidence that they have been trained in privacy and compliance, and we want to look at their policies and procedures around that. But most importantly here, we want to look at their access management process. So if an employee leaves or is terminated, how do they revoke that access? When do they do that? What does that process look like? Now, every single one of us is going to go through this where we ask for something and we can't get it, and it's a pretty frustrating feeling. But many times this happens because vendors are of such a size that it's not practical or realistic for them to answer every single due diligence request. You may see this a lot with really large companies like Google, AWS, Amazon, national banks, etc. What's important to keep in mind here is that they do generally realize that their customers need this information, and most of them will either provide it directly on their website, or if you ask their sales rep or customer service center, they will direct you to a customer-specific website where you can look at things like SOC reports and privacy policies, etc. Now, sometimes it's not that easy. You might have to research a little bit to get what you need, but generally you can find it. On the other hand, there are vendors out there that either don't have the information you need or they don't want to share what they do have. Let's say in the first case, maybe you have a startup vendor who can't provide that SOC 2 Type 2 yet because they're only in their second year of business. Okay, fair enough. But the burden of proof is still on them. If they want the business, they have to come up with some alternative documentation or other methods that can evidence that they have the necessary controls. In a lot of cases, maybe an on-site visit will satisfy some of that evidence, or maybe an interview with one of their senior leaders and one of your SMEs. Let's say your SME talks to their head of InfoSec or their CISO. In any case, it's recommended that you always document your requests and the lack of them, that if you decide to use alternative evidence, you document what that is and what the outcome was. And if there's nothing to be had, you may have to go to your senior leaders and get a risk exception if the decision is to move forward with them. Just keep in mind that when an auditor looks at this process, they're going to want to make sure that you did everything within your power to obtain the information, and if you couldn't get it for some reason, that the risk acceptance was made at the right level of the company and has justification. When you conclude your due diligence, you may find that there are still some risks out there that you're not too comfortable with, and you have to decide how you're going to handle them. So these are the 4 common risk handling techniques. The first one is to accept the risk. That means formally accepting the risk. And you've got to understand that the point of risk management first is to identify and understand that risk. Then we have to decide if the risk is acceptable. And there are going to be times when risk just cannot be mitigated. And that's just part of doing business, right? So the point here is we want to make sure that our senior leaders are aware and that they can make informed decisions on what to do about it. Sometimes that decision is just going to be to accept the risk. But the best practice here is always making sure that the risk acceptances are done at the appropriate level of the organization, that they're documented and include the justification for accepting the risk. The next thing is to transfer the risk. Now that's a little tricky because we know we can't outsource risk, but what does it mean to transfer risk? In this case, we're transferring the risk to insure against loss. So we're transferring the financial liability of that risk to someone else. The best example of this would be by way of insurance policies or contractual terms that still hold your organization accountable but transfer that financial impact to another party, such as the insurer. Then there's avoiding the risk. Just don't do it. Don't send more information than you need to. Don't use certain methods for transferring data. Having good risk-based training in the organization is also a great way to help everyone in their part of risk avoidance. Now, the last thing, and most commonly, is mitigate by implementing controls. Now, I want to talk about controls just a bit more, and this is because always when we have our webinars, we have such a broad range of people who are joining, and some of us are new to these concepts, so I do want to talk about controls for just a minute. Controls are a combination of people, processes, and tools that we put in place to prevent, detect, or correct issues that are caused by unwanted events. When we talk about mitigating controls, we can be talking about internal or external controls. So something your organization does or something your vendor does. Some examples of having internal controls might be requiring a separation of duties. So the person approving the expense is not the same one writing the check. Or ensuring that a quorum of committee members are present before taking an important vote. Employee background checks are another example of a preventative control. Another example would be if you're engaging a vendor to provide customer service at a call center, one of the risks in that activity is customer dissatisfaction. So one of the controls you can have is ensuring that the customer service agents are well trained in both issue remediation and appropriate messaging. So those are some examples of controls, and we use controls all the time to mitigate our risks.
Our second poll question of the day is, does your current vendor risk management process calculate and consider residual risk? Yes, no, but we are planning to, no, or you're unsure. And Hillary, I have another question here that I think we can go ahead and answer.
Super.
And that question is, do we need to do risk assessments for just the vendor or each engagement with the vendor?
This is a great question. It's one we get asked a lot. So here's the answer. Very clearly, you need to be risk assessing at the product or service level, first of all. So each product and service that you get from a single vendor may have a different risk profile. Therefore, you have to assess at that product or service level. Now, if you have multiple products and services from one vendor, the vendor's overall risk rating should automatically default to the highest risk rating of any product or service they provide. That way you're going to make sure they have the right level of ongoing monitoring and annual risk reviews, etc., and that when audit comes in, they will understand that there may be multiple products and services, but we're always defaulting to the highest risk level just to be really thorough. I hope that helps everybody understand that question.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. And please go ahead and submit your responses as we will be closing the poll momentarily. And if you do have any issues with submitting your poll response, please send us a message in the Ask Question widget and we'll be happy to assist. Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our Types of Third-Party Vendor Risk ebook within the Related Content widget. This ebook goes into detail about the different types of vendor risk. Hillary, I'll pass it back to you.
So after you've conducted your due diligence, you're going to figure out what the residual risk of that vendor engagement is. Now, keep in mind, we've already done our inherent risk assessment, which considers all the risk types and amounts that can be present in that product or service. Then we look for the vendor controls to see how those risks can be mitigated. And again, at the end of that process, we have something called our residual risk level. Now, keep in mind that the residual risk level is purely there to help our organization decide if the planned treatment, how we handled those risks was enough or not, and if the risk level is acceptable. I did say before, we are not going to completely eliminate all the risks because that's just not possible. Therefore, some risks are going to remain at a specific level, and it's your organization's risk appetite that will guide you in determining if that risk is going to be acceptable. So another way to think about this would be, is your organization okay with big risk, right? Maybe there's a big payoff. Or maybe your organization prefers minimal risk and more security. In any case, it's usually not up to third-party risk management to determine the risk appetite, but you should have some guidelines as to whether or not a certain risk level will be okay and to move forward. So let's look at how this works in practice. All right, so assuming that you've been able to reduce your residual risk, your controls are in a good place, we feel confident in them. If you've been able to reduce the risk, then it's probably good to move on. You can set your next risk review up, you can move forward towards that contract, but you need to keep your eye on things, and that's through ongoing monitoring and periodic due diligence and just staying aware of events that go on that may impact your third party. Now, I want to be really, really clear on something, and I need everyone to listen very carefully. Residual risk is not a risk rating. It is a measure of effective control, right? That residual risk score is just telling us how confident we are in those controls. And why is that important? Well, the purpose of the inherent risk score is to identify the types and amounts of risks in that engagement. And that inherent risk score is what's going to drive all of our vendor risk management activities throughout its life cycle, from how much due diligence they need and how often, to how often we have risk reviews, performance reviews, etc. Your residual risk score is only used to calculate your confidence in the controls. Please do not use your residual risk score to set any kind of intervals for risk re-reviews or performance management, because that is an audit waiting to happen, right? Do not do that. Only use this residual risk score to talk about the confidence of your controls. Now let's assume that your risk rating, your residual risk score is exactly the same as your inherent risk rating, which means that you really haven't been able to mitigate that risk very much. That is a really good time to stop and review and go back and see if there are any additional controls that can be implemented, or using another risk handling technique. Maybe you're going to need more insurance from this vendor, for example, or you're just going to have to accept the risk as it is. But at any time there's no change between your inherent risk assessment and your residual risk score, you need to stop and review. Now, I think it is time for our very last poll of the day. Abby?
Our next poll question of the day is, today our credit union's vendor risk assessment process is mature, documented processes, clear roles and responsibilities for all stakeholders, comprehensive and actionable outputs, effective issue management and tracking. Developing, most processes are documented and clear roles and responsibilities for most stakeholders. Process outputs, issue management, and tracking may need improvement. Newly implemented, all processes are not yet documented. Roles and responsibilities are evolving. Process output is limited, and issue management is developing, or you're not sure. And Hillary, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience. And that question is, we have a lot of old vendors who haven't gone through the vendor risk process. How should we address them?
Well, the first way you should address them is with a sense of urgency. You know, we probably all have some vendors out there that are legacy vendors, or maybe they're not the highest risk vendors, and they're sitting out there without having gone through the rigorous process of risk assessment and due diligence and monitoring. And I don't want anyone to panic if this is your situation, but I do want you to get that list of vendors and start at the very least risk assessing those relationships so you can prioritize which ones you're going to collect due diligence on and what the management routine should look like. Now, another thing you have to be aware of is if you're asking your vendors to do something that they haven't done before, you may get some pushback or some questions, and you do need to be prepared to address those with your vendors. So I would always say that as you're working through this process, make sure that the vendor owner knows what's going to happen. You can even give them a little script about what's going on if the vendor has any questions. And as soon as you start asking that vendor for any due diligence documentation, you want to be really clear about why it's needed and why it's important to get it to you right away. So don't panic, just get organized and start prioritizing the highest risk vendors to go through the process first. I hope that answers that question.
Great, thanks Hillary. And here are those results. Thank you to everyone for answering this question, as it is interesting to see what everyone says. Before we move on, I would like to mention that we have our Inherent Vendor Risk Sample Questions and Next Steps ebook available for download in the Related Content widget. As we just talked about getting from inherent risk to residual risk, you might find this resource helpful. And let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Hillary.
So as we begin to wrap things up here, I do want to step back in and really talk about risk assessments as they relate to being compliant with regulations. So all financial institutions, regardless of what type they are, have some common threads. Those would be that the board of directors and senior management are accountable and make sure that the third-party risk activity is performed in a safe and sound way, that policies governing the use of third parties should be approved by the board of directors or the highest level of senior management. But when it comes to credit unions, they need to really make sure that they are going to plan how they're going to manage the third party and ensure that they have the resources and expertise to do it, as well as making sure that the risk management efforts and activities are commensurate with the level of risk, right? So we're doing it in proportion. The higher the risk, the more robust the third-party risk management is. We do know that critical activities require the most robust management and risk assessments, and that credit unions must make sure that there is adequate due diligence and monitoring for the duration of the relationship. So that's making sure you're risk assessing those controls and periodically reassessing them. Now, all right, so with the NCUA, specifically around risk assessments, there is clear language about risk assessment and planning, due diligence, risk measurement, monitoring, and control. If you have not read the guidance, I suggest that you do that so that you can make sure that your program is covering all the necessary components to keep you in regulatory compliance. All right, so as we wrap up today, let's wrap up this session with some best practices. The first one is standardize your risk assessment practices. That means we use the same inherent risk assessment questionnaire. That means that we have the same vendor risk questionnaire, that we have good, consistent standards around our due diligence. And the other part of that is limit your exceptions, right? Let's not make a bunch of exceptions to these practices. We want to adhere to our standards. We also want to make sure that those standards are documented, including our general risk methodology and the minimum requirements we have around risk assessments, we want those in our third-party risk management policy. Another one goes without saying, but always follow that vendor risk management life cycle. It is a guideline that will tell you not only the things you need to do, but the order in which you need to do them. And then, as I mentioned earlier, never, ever, ever use your residual risk score in place of an inherent risk rating. So don't set any of your vendor risk management activities based on that residual risk score. That residual risk score is only to see if you are confident in your controls, nothing else. Make sure you track and manage and report any vendor issues, and that includes risk issues. So let's say that you have a risk that was identified during due diligence. It's not a deal breaker, but it's something that we need the vendor to remediate. We put it in the contract, and we also keep it on an open issues list until it is remediated. So it's really important to track and manage these. Now, if all of this is overwhelming you and you do not have the time and resources to do any of it, you can consider outsourcing some of these activities to help you improve your internal capacity. So there's all kinds of firms that provide third-party risk management services. That can include everything from collecting your due diligence documents to providing you with SME reviews, etc. So don't forget that there is external resources available should you need them. And then finally, you know, risk assessments, developing the processes, it's not one and done. It's an evolving practice. So always strive for improvements because no process is perfect. And with that, I thank you for being with me today, and I'm going to turn it back over to Abby. Abby?
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I want to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Hillary for her time and sharing some really important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. November 1st, our How to Create and Use Key Third-Party Risk Management Metrics. And on November 15th, our Incorporating Vendor Issue Management into Your Third-Party Risk Management Process. We hope that you will be able to join us for those sessions as well. A link to register for those sessions is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Hillary, the next question is, what constitutes proof of regulatory compliance?
That is such a great question. And I'll tell you why. Because when we say proof or articles of evidence, you know, that can mean a lot of different things depending on what we're talking about. So when it comes to regulatory compliance, when we're looking at those vendors, we want to look at a couple things. First of all, we want to make sure that there are no regulatory findings or issues requiring remediation. We want to make sure that they are okay with the regulators, at least from a public standpoint. We also want to look at their policies and procedures around those issues that we have some sensitivity, like you know, their privacy policy. We want to make sure that they reflect clearly in those policies what regulations they're trying to meet, et cetera, excuse me. And when it gets down to sort of the last thing we want to look at, we want to look at training for their employees. So are their employees getting trained in regulatory matters? Now, depending on the vendor and what their employees are doing, that could look like everything from, hey, do they understand, you know, fair lending rules? Do they understand fraud and AML? Privacy is pretty much a across-the-board one. So for your proof of regulatory compliance, just make sure that they don't have any open actions or issues. Look at their policies and procedures and look at their employee training. And thanks for asking such a great question.
Great. Thanks, Hillary. The next question I have here is, how often should you reassess the low inherent risk vendors?
Well, ones are low risk vendors. They're basically that. They're low risk. And so generally speaking, if you're planning out a schedule, you can have your low risk vendors up for reassessment like every other to even 3 years. The caveat is if that vendor should start providing another product or service, they need to be risk assessed based on that product or service. So maybe your low risk vendor, great, you have them for a year and a half. You think, oh, we're going to buy something else from them now. Well, go ahead and risk assess that engagement. It may turn out that they're not low risk anymore. And so then they need to be moved to an appropriate schedule based on that risk rating. So if they're a single product or service provider, they're low risk, 2 to 3 years, the minute they start selling you something else, reassess them right away.
Perfect. Thanks so much. The next question I have here is, if the vendor due diligence process is outsourced, what would be the best practice for our internal review?
Well, I am not 100% sure I understand the question fully, but let me see if I can interpret it. So let's assume that you've decided to go ahead and outsource maybe your due diligence collection and risk assessments, vendor risk assessments, to a third-party service company. In that case, they're going to go ahead and they're going to get the documents, they're going to review those risk questionnaires, and they're going to come up with those, qualified opinions that are documented in their report about the sufficiency of those controls and possibly make a recommendation as to whether or not you should move forward with them. Now, just because you have that outsourced doesn't mean that you're done. You still have to have someone come in and, at least take a look at what the risk experts are providing and make a decision on whether or not you're going to follow it or not. Just make sure you understand it is what they're saying. Now, this is going to be a lot less work for sure than trying to get all those risk assessments done yourself. But remember, no matter what you outsource, you always have responsibility for the risk. And that goes exactly the same if you're using a third-party risk service company to help you with any portion of your third-party risk process. I hope that's helpful. If it's not, we'll follow up an email if you let me know you had a different question.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Hillary. The next question I have here is, who determines the criteria for critical vendors?
Well, it should be the team or the person who's responsible for third-party risk management. They should be able to come up with the criteria. But remember, that criteria has to be approved kind of universally. So this is something that we need to have some discussions with stakeholders because we're going to want to put that criteria into our policy. So, we go through the questions about what to consider, what are the questions that we should ask on the risk assessment, and that's great. But just make sure that you have the stakeholders weigh in. Maybe there's something unique to your organization that needs to be considered. But it's really the third-party risk manager, program manager, that should be responsible for implementing that criteria and documenting it in the policy.
Perfect. Thanks, Hillary. And I think we have time for one more question. And that question is, what should we do about old vendors who have not gone through the vendor risk process?
I feel like this is a question that always comes up whenever we talk about risk assessments because we've all got them. That old legacy vendor out there. The first thing is, start where you're at. You've got to risk assess them. And before you go ahead and do that, it's a really good idea, I think I mentioned earlier, to go ahead and let the vendor owner know that this is an issue. And, backing up just a step, if they haven't been through any of this process, they may not even have a designated vendor owner. So that might be your first step. But assuming that you can find the vendor owner, let them know, tell them to communicate to the vendor what the expectations are. If they have to log into your system, the vendor's going to need to know how to do all that stuff. Risk rate them, start getting that due diligence done. The minute you are aware of contracts or vendors that are outside the process, it's a really good idea to document it and be prepared to mention that as a self-identified audit issue if it should come up. And I hope that's helpful.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all of the time we have left for questions today. So thank you, Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address with you offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Hillary as well for her time and great content. And ask even more questions inside our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics, including risk assessing your vendors to assist you. If you'd like to become a member of the third-party think tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and then we'll send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also within that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.